There were a lot of quarterbacks who transferred schools last offseason. There were a lot of big names that changed programs and a number of smaller ones as well. Overall, how did these quarterbacks do? Did the quarterbacks who transferred have successful seasons at their new programs? Let's take a look. We'll start with the ones who had good seasons, and there was actually quite a bunch. The best transfer this past year was probably Shedeur Sanders. He transferred from Jackson State to Colorado. He completed 69% of his passes while throwing for over 3,200 yards. He had 27 passing touchdowns and only 3 interceptions. He also added 4 touchdowns on the ground as well. I know things kind of went off the rails for Colorado in the second half, but it was still an impressive season, and making the jump from Jackson State to Colorado, I think Shedeur Sanders was by far the best transfer quarterback from this past offseason. After a lengthy career at Wake Forest, Sam Hartman transferred to Notre Dame. He ended up the season throwing for 2,700 yards with 24 passing touchdowns and 8 interceptions. He also added 3 touchdowns on the ground as well. I guess overall, it was a pretty good season, but honestly, I was expecting a little bit more from Hartman. I mean, when you look at his production from Wake Forest, he was one of the better quarterbacks in all of college football from 2021 through 2022. So I guess me personally, I was a little disappointed by the season he had. But overall, Notre Dame was in the top 25 when it was all said and done, and he still put up some really solid numbers. So Sam Hartman, I'll say, had a good year. I mentioned this the other day, but it seems like DJ Uiagalelei reinvented his career at Oregon State. But when comparing numbers to his previous season at Clemson, that wasn't really the case. He threw for 2,600 yards, only 100 more yards than last season. He also had 21 passing touchdowns, 1 fewer than last season as well. But it was a great season for Oregon State as they finished the season ranked inside the top 25 and were a legitimate threat in the Pac-12. So I guess you could say it was a solid season for Uiagalelei. This was the one that shocked me the most, and I owe Graham Mertz an apology. After a very underwhelming career at Wisconsin, he transferred to Florida. Now, prior to the start of the season, I said he wouldn't make a difference and he probably wouldn't finish the season as the starting quarterback. In 11 games, Mertz completed 73% of his passes while throwing for just under 3,000 yards. He had 20 passing touchdowns with only 3 interceptions. He also added 4 touchdowns on the ground as well. I know it was a disappointing season for the Florida Gators, but honestly, Graham Mertz did all he could, and I thought he did a fantastic job this season. After spending 3 seasons at Purdue and 1 at Cal, Jack Plummer transferred to Louisville. He threw for over 3,000 yards this season with 21 passing touchdowns. Those are some pretty solid numbers, and he led Louisville to the ACC title game. I know he looked atrocious in that game against Florida State, but if you would have told Cardinals fans at the beginning of the season that they'd be playing for the conference championship and that Plummer would throw for over 3,000 yards, I think you would take that in a heartbeat. After 4 seasons at NC State, Devon Ly transferred to Kentucky. He was one of the better quarterbacks in all of college football a couple years ago, and I thought he would really be a great get for the Wildcats. In 12 games, he threw for over 2,400 yards with 23 passing touchdowns. I mean, when looking at those numbers, I guess you could say it was an okay season. I mean, it's really hard to get upset at 2,500 yards and 23 passing touchdowns, but considering where this guy was at a couple years ago, and considering the quarterback play at Kentucky the last couple of years, I was personally expecting more. But hey, maybe there are Kentucky fans out there that were more than okay with the season that Devon Ly gave them. Who saw this kind of season coming from Georgia Tech? And that's largely due to the play of quarterback Haynes King. After spending 3 seasons with Texas A&M, he transferred last offseason. He finished the year throwing for nearly 3,000 yards with 26 passing touchdowns. He also added over 600 yards on the ground with 9 rushing scores. He was one of the better dual-threat quarterbacks in all of college football. So considering Georgia Tech didn't have many expectations this season, and Haynes King hadn't really ever done anything while at A&M, this is actually one of the better transfer quarterbacks we got this past season. Alright, the last one we're going to be talking about that had a good season was Georgia Southern quarterback Davis Brin. After spending 4 seasons at Tulsa, he transferred this past offseason. He completed 65% of his passes while throwing for nearly 3,500 yards. He also had 22 passing touchdowns and a touchdown on the ground as well. I mean, I'm sure Georgia Southern wasn't expecting to be in the national championship conversation, so getting 3,500 500 yards and 22 touchdowns from a transfer quarterback, that's got to be pretty good. There's a couple quarterbacks I briefly want to mention whose season was ended due to injuries. We'll start with Cade McNamara, who transferred to Iowa after being the starting quarterback at Michigan. He appeared in only 5 games before he suffered a season-ending injury. He threw for 500 yards in those games with 4 passing touchdowns, so the numbers weren't exactly all that exciting. But Iowa's offense definitely took a massive hit when he was out for the year. Another quarterback who missed most of the season was Florida Atlantic quarterback Casey Thompson. After spending his career with Texas and Nebraska, he appeared in only 3 games with the Owls. He threw for 500 yards with 5 passing touchdowns before his season was cut short with an injury as well. Alright, let's take a look at the quarterbacks who were very underwhelming. We'll start with NC State quarterback Brennan Armstrong. After emerging as one of the better quarterbacks in all of college football in 2021, I really thought NC State was picking up a good option when Devon Ly left, but that just wasn't the case. In 11 games, Armstrong only threw for 1,600 yards and had only 11 passing touchdowns. He did have 500 yards on the ground with 6 rushing scores, but considering this was a guy that threw for nearly 4,500 yards a couple years ago, the fact that he only gave you 1,600 yards in 11 games, yeah, that's pretty disappointing. After having a successful career at SMU, I thought Tanner Mordecai going to Wisconsin was going to be massive, but that just wasn't the case. He appeared in 9 games, throwing for only 1,700 yards with only 6 passing touchdowns. He did rush for 300 yards with 4 rushing scores, but man, what a letdown this season for him. His previous 2 years at SMU, he threw for at least 33 passing touchdowns and at least 3,500 yards in both years. Now, I know the offenses are entirely different, but I don't think many people were hoping he'd have only 6 passing touchdowns in 9 games. The numbers weren't terrible for Purdue quarterback Hudson Card, but man, if you watched any Purdue game, it was ugly out there. The former Texas quarterback threw for 2,400 yards and had 15 passing touchdowns. He also added 5 touchdowns on the ground with 200 yards as well. Again, those numbers aren't exactly horrible by any means. There are definitely some worse numbers on this list, but this was a guy that I honestly thought was going to come in and really have a breakthrough season with the Boilermakers. Payton Thorne emerged as one of the better quarterbacks in the Big Ten during his tenure in Michigan State. By transferring to Auburn, I thought they were really going to get an upgrade at the position, but that just wasn't the case. In 12 games, he threw for only 1,700 yards with 15 passing touchdowns and 9 interceptions. He did add 500 yards on the ground and had 3 rushing scores as well. Again, when you look at his numbers overall for the season, they're not exactly horrendous, but for an Auburn starting quarterback in the SEC, and considering the seasons he had while in Michigan State, I thought that he was going to put up much better numbers than he did at Auburn. Unfortunately, it's really looking like Kedon Slovis peaked all the way back in 2019. After spending time with USC and Pittsburgh, he transferred to BYU this offseason, and I was really high on him. He appeared in 8 games total, but completed only 57% of his passes for 1,700 yards. He did have 12 passing touchdowns and only 6 interceptions, but again, I thought it was a very disappointing season for him at BYU. I thought he might revert back to what we saw in 2019, where he emerged as one of the more exciting quarterbacks in the entire country, but he just couldn't live up to the expectations once again. We'll wrap up today's video with probably the most disappointing transfer of the entire offseason. Jeff Sims transferred to Nebraska after 3 years at Georgia Tech. He made it only 5 games, and man, it's amazing he made it that long. In those 5 games, he threw for only 300 yards with 1 passing touchdown and 6 interceptions. He did have 200 yards on the ground with a rushing score, but man, he was probably one of the worst quarterbacks in all of college football this season. So which transfer quarterback had the best season at their new program? Or was there a transfer quarterback I forgot to include in today's video? Whoever it is, let me know in the comment section down below. Before you leave, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on those notifications if you're new to my channel. I'm posting college football videos all off season, so make sure to subscribe so you never miss a video. If you love college football, this is definitely the place for you. Also, don't forget to drop a like on this video as well. It helps out with that YouTube algorithm and helps share the video with more college football fans. Plus, it only takes a second to do. As always, thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you all in my next video.